let's talk about the second one that I think is important is client. And again, I think this one is fairly easy to assess, but it's so important. Let's talk about how the client is measured in valuation.
Yeah, again, I mentioned a little earlier about there's one that I think is the most important. I think client's probably 1B, right? This is your how many customers do you have? What do your contracts look like? What's your revenue generators? Is it all from one person at one company, or is it across a multitude of customers? Is it all mom and pops, or is it big multinationals? So this really deep dives into just how you're generating your revenue, your contracts, that sort of stuff.
Right. I mean, I think it's interesting when you get to clients because everybody's really proud of their clients and they're proud of the names. But what are the red flags? Like when you go into a company, what tend to be the red flags that you see when you look at client lists?
A couple of big ones, I think, are who owns the client relationship. A lot of times when we go in, it's the owner that owns all the relationships with the client, which you may think, well, as an owner, I should be involved and I should own those. But that's a red flag to a potential buyer because obviously you're going to exit the business when you sell, and now all those relationships, they have to be rebuilt. Another one is how much, again, percentage of revenue generated by client. If you have 90% of your annual revenue from one client, that's going to be a red flag to people. They like to see a more diversified portfolio of, no more than 5, 10, 15% being driven by one client.
Right. I think sometimes we think about client lists and we think about famous names or that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, it really is the diversity of that client list. And again, we were just in a meeting, you and I, meeting with a client. And one of the things they told us was that 90% of their revenue came from one client. And the person that owned that relationship left the organization and took it with them. Can you imagine losing 90% of your revenue?
It makes for some tough conversations around the leadership table, doesn't it? Because you're going to have to cut heads, and I mean you're going to have to really go into survival mode at that point.
Right. And so I think as you look at your client list, the one thing that always is around diversity, that we're not tied to any one client in the distribution. And the second thing you again talked about was the owner. And I know I was guilty of this, is we get really prideful of our relationships. We want to talk about how great salespeople we are. And what I found when I heard this a long time ago, somebody said, you have to back up. You can't be the hero of the story. And at first, I kind of took it personally, but what I realized was ultimately if we were going to grow the business and drive value, I had to step back. And one of the things I remember is when I started turning things more over, man, I wanted to get on that phone and I wanted to get involved. And I used to go to my office and I would literally sit and twiddle my thumbs because no matter how bad I wanted to pick up that phone, I knew I couldn't do it. I had to let my team do it.
And it's a challenge because usually the owners probably built that relationship over multi-years. How do you transition that relationship now to someone else?
Right.
And it's not something that's going to happen overnight, which again, you have to do it by design. You can't allow your relationships with your customer just to transition by chance.
No. And so again, if we're looking for that, we have to look at those.